Welcome to the Library of Ideas, created by the team of the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. Today, we begin a new journey, a series of 38 episodes based on the book, The Universal History of Civilizations Through the Minds and Souls of Humanity. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity wandered. Then, one morning, we stopped. The step that once meant survival became the first stone of permanence. Isn't it strange? The moment we ceased to move, the world itself began to change. What are we going to talk about today? Episode 1. When Humanity Stopped Wandering. The First Great Revolution. Part 1. Before the Seed, the Last Wanderers. The world still moved. Nothing stayed still long enough to belong to anyone. Herds drifted across wide plains. The wind carried the smell of rain from far-off hills, and people followed rhythms greater than themselves. Around 12,000 BCE, as the last ice age loosened its grip, small bands of humans, 30, maybe 50, walked the valleys of the Levant and Anatolia, tracing the invisible paths their ancestors had once walked. They had no maps, only memory, stories of kind rivers, bone-breaking winters, and places where spirits still listened. They lived in the way we now call Natufian, brush and stone villages near the caves of Mount Carmel, near the waters that would cradle Jericho. They lingered longer than their forebears, building round huts, storing grain they did not yet know how to grow. Dogs, once wolves, padded beside their fires. The world of motion was slowing, though no one yet called it change. In that life, everything was shared, because nothing could be owned. A spear, a pelt, a song. Each belonged to whoever needed it most. Hunger decided what was fair. Children learned the sky before the earth. They could read the wind before a storm, sense the restlessness of animals, smell the thaw before the snow began to rot. The elders guided not by command, but by memory, remembering where the ancestors slept and where they never returned. At night, they sat around a fire that was never quite the same, yet always familiar. Someone hummed an old chant. Another answered with the story of a hunt. The world outside was endless, but the circle of firelight felt like home. In that circle, time was a visitor, not a master. Yet beneath that rhythm, unease began to grow. The herds were smaller, the rains later, the rivers fickle. The stories no longer matched the land. Something was changing. One season, a child found a patch of greener grass near a spring that never ran dry. The next day, the tribe lingered. They mended tools, cleaned hides, rested animals. A few days later, they were still there. Someone joked the place remembered them. Someone else said, maybe they should let it. You see, the laughter faded, and the silence that followed felt heavy. It was the first hesitation in human history, the moment before the seed. By around 10,000 BCE, at Jericho, low walls began to rise, perhaps to hold back floods, perhaps to hold something else. The journey that once defined freedom began to feel like exile. The last wanderers did not vanish all at once. They simply stopped walking, one sunrise at a time. And when they did, the world changed its rhythm, forever.
Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the Library of Ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment.
The last wanderers had stopped walking. In their stillness, the seed appeared, small, fragile, full of promise. The first seed was pressed into the earth not for abundance, but for hope. It was a gesture of defiance against hunger, a quiet gamble on the patience of the soil. Around 9500 BCE, in the fertile valleys of the upper Euphrates and the Anatolian plateau, people began to stay. They no longer followed the herds, but the seasons. The wild grains that had once been gathered now grew near their dwellings: emmer, barley, einkorn, bent by the same hands that once only plucked them. At first, it felt almost magical. From what was taken, something returned. But soon, the seed demanded more than it gave. The earth had to be cleared, guarded, watered. The harvest had to be measured and stored. The people who once shared everything began to divide. One family's plot lay beside another's, marked by a ridge of stones or a furrow. Land became something that could be defended. Ownership, an idea older than the plough itself, took root in human thought. At Chayonu and later at Çatalhöyük, homes were pressed close together, walls touching, roofs serving as streets. Each hearth marked a lineage. Clay figurines, mostly of women, watched over the rooms, symbols of fertility and continuity. People buried their dead beneath the floors so the ancestors would not wander. The living and the dead shared the same house, the same ground. The settlement had become an organism, breathing, expanding, remembering. Work, once spontaneous and light, hardened into rhythm. Days were counted, moons observed. The first calendars were not written, but felt. In the return of the flood, the angle of sunlight, the ripening of grain. Time became measurable, and therefore oppressive. The same force that promised security now chained existence to repetition. The seed brought plenty, but also anxiety. A single storm, a swarm of locusts, one missed rain, and months of labor could vanish. Fear crept into the relationship with the earth. People began to speak of spirits within the fields, of offerings that must be made to ensure fertility. Gratitude became obligation. A handful of barley tossed into the fire was no longer thanks, but insurance. And yet, they could not go back. The wandering life had become impossible. The settlements had grown too heavy with memory. The people of the New World awoke each morning to a landscape of their own making, and that too was a kind of captivity. In the stillness between sowing and harvest, humanity discovered the two sides of possession, to hold and to fear. The seed gave birth not only to sustenance, but to time itself, the first invisible master. And under its quiet rule, the story of civilization unfolded. One furrow, one wall, one anxious prayer at a time. Let's pause for a moment and look at what really happened when the seed became the center of life. The grain no longer fed only the body. It began to rule the mind. What had once been planted as an act of gratitude was now tended in fear. Too much rain, too little sun, and the people whispered that the earth was angry. By around 7000 BCE, in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, something extraordinary appeared. Places like Göbekli Tepe, Navali Chori, and later Tel Hassuna, the first stone sanctuaries of humankind. Here, worship became visible. Where once people sang to the open air, now they built walls and columns. Carvings of vultures, bulls, and serpents stared down from the stones. The gods, once everywhere, were now given addresses. And from that moment, divinity settled as firmly as the people themselves. The temples rose at the heart of each settlement. At first, they were open to everyone, a place to gather, feast, and share what the harvest offered. But over time, the feasts turned into ceremonies, and ceremonies needed order. Someone had to decide when to plant, when to reap, and how to please the powers above. From that need emerged the first priests, men and women who studied the sky, who marked the passage of the moon, who spoke on behalf of forces no one could see. They became interpreters of balance or of punishment. A failed harvest meant someone had angered the divine. A storm meant debts unpaid. The gods who had once danced within nature were now accountants of obedience. Offerings grew more elaborate: grain, beer, the first animals, and later, blood. Fear, slowly, took the shape of devotion. The priests recorded their duties in clay, the same clay that once cradled the seed. Simple tokens marked grain, flocks, or offerings. Soon, these marks stood for more than goods. They stood for power. A symbol on a tablet could measure not only wheat, but guilt. And so, from small signs of devotion, the first writing was born, the scripts of Sumer, the dawn of both history and bureaucracy. Social order began to harden around this sacred arithmetic. At the top stood those who mediated between man and sky, the keepers of calendars and sacrifice. Below them, the farmers, the builders, the potters, those who worked the rhythm of the earth. And somewhere in between, the first chiefs, wearing masks of animals and claiming the right to speak for the gods. The circle of nature had become a pyramid. By 6000 BCE, the rhythm of the earth was no longer enough. It needed supervision. The heavens were charted and named, their movements tied to ritual. Time, once a friend, turned into a ledger. Every action had a season, every season a price. People lived by divine schedules, terrified of falling out of alignment. And when the torches dimmed and the chants faded, silence returned to the fields. But it was no longer peaceful. It felt watched. The gods who had once been everywhere were now above, waiting to be paid. You know, in that heavy stillness, humanity discovered the first taste of guilt, the understanding that order, once born of gratitude, could also demand control. I walk among stones that were once walls, tracing the faint geometry of a vanished order. Beneath the grass lie fragments of sickles, ash, and broken idols. The air is dry, the silence deep. Nothing here moves, and yet there is a hum, faint, steady, the echo of a world that once decided to stay. Archaeologists call this the Neolithic horizon, around 6000 BCE. But standing here, time feels irrelevant. The people who built this place did not know they were inventing history. Their world was small, bounded by fields and fears. They traded the sky for soil, the horizon for walls. And yet, it worked for a while. The grain returned each year. The gods were appeased. The children lived longer than their parents. From this fragile rhythm, civilization grew. Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the countless empires that followed. Every temple, every ledger, every law, each can trace its lineage back to these first furrows in the earth. I pick up a shard of pottery, its edge still sharp, its surface marked by the print of a thumb. Perhaps it belonged to a woman shaping vessels for grain, or to a man carrying water from the river. Their names are gone, but their gesture remains. In pressing the clay, they press themselves into time. Was this the beginning of progress or of captivity? The last wanderers could cross continents without leaving a trace. The first settlers could not move without leaving ruins. Freedom was exchanged for continuity, risk for certainty. They gained the power to stay and the burden to maintain. Looking around, I sense both pride and warning. The fields that once promised abundance became boundaries. The gods who blessed the soil began to demand obedience. The calendar, born to guide the harvest, became the measure of a life's worth. The settlers sought safety from chaos and built a different kind of wilderness, the one inside order itself. The wind rises, brushing the grass in slow waves. It sounds like the murmur of distant footsteps, still walking somewhere beyond the edge of memory. Perhaps the story of humanity did not begin here, in these fields of permanence, but in the hesitation before them, when someone paused between staying and leaving, and in that hesitation invented both civilization and loss. Thank you for joining us today, here at the Library of Ideas, created by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. This was the first episode of the Universal History of Civilizations. Join us again next Saturday for the next part, Sumer, the city that invented time. And don't forget, every Wednesday, we release new episodes from our other series, The History of Economics in 25 Scenes. Until next time, may your thoughts keep wandering, even when the world tells you to stay.